Hey everyone, RogueGold here. We're now a bit over a week from when the new update for the Division 2 and the game's first ever Incursion released. Now, overall, I would say this update has been a pretty big hit. Great reception across the board. There's some choice quality of life changes that were made. People seem to be enjoying the new content overall. There's been a few issues, most notably an annoying one with the Incursion weekly chest reset. But as a whole, the technical side of this update has been quite stable compared to the last few updates, so I certainly hope that is a trend we see continue. However, with all of that said, there is one thing I did want to specifically focus on for this video, and that is the Paradise Lost Incursion. As I mentioned a moment ago, this is the game's first incursion, and so what I really want to do in this video is give my impressions of it after a full week of playing through it, report some of what I've seen from reactions around the community, and basically just give a bit of commentary as for how I think this should or will fit into the Division 2's future content plans, if we are to continue receiving content after Year 5 Season 4 and the new DLC. So, should be a fun discussion. If you enjoy commentary like this and you want to stay up to date on the latest with the Division 2, then consider clicking that subscribe button. Thank you in advance. Alright, Paradise Lost. I'm just gonna cut to the chase. I really enjoyed this incursion. Now, it is important to keep in mind that my perspective is one of a more veteran and hardcore background. I am typically able to get a group together to run content like this, so I'm not in the same boat as others who may not have those luxuries or who might have tried this content out and thought it was too difficult. However, I do want to dive into a bit of why I think that is okay, and that'll make more sense in a minute. But let's back up and talk about this thing itself. Now, incursions within the Division franchise come with a certain degree of nostalgia and quality, as they were that pinnacle endgame content back in the original game. We had 4 of them that covered very different levels of difficulty and intricacy and mechanics. And so to finally be getting one in the sequel's 5th year of post-launch content, there was a lot of questions as for if this would live up to the legacy of those old ones, how it would compare to the Big Brother-like content of raids. In my view, Paradise Lost has navigated that just about as well as it possibly could have. It is, I would argue, just as intense and mechanically involved as the Division 1's final and most refined incursion, Stolen Signal, while also adopting many aspects from the Division 2's raids that worked so well, namely the boss UI and combat design, and despite all of that, it still feels notably different from the game's 2 raids. There is still a lot of challenge and difficulty here with Paradise Lost, but its fights and mechanics are tuned really just right to be difficult enough for coordinated teams to have to figure out how to complete them in their early runs, while also not being so convoluted as to completely alienate matchmade or non-communicative teams. The other thing about Paradise Lost that truly surprised and pleased me was just how all-encompassing it is for different types of players. Are you more of a lore person? Well, there's 10 comms to collect from here, all of which I think are quite interesting. They also brought back the artifact section, and if you're a completionist, there's hidden rewards to track down tied to specific challenges. All of this just fleshes out what the experience has to offer, and I think it really promotes replayability beyond just earning that one exclusive exotic that we've all come to expect. So I truly do believe, just in this first week of it being out, that Paradise Lost and incursions in general for the Division 2 have carved out their space as a distinct endgame experience. To go over some specifics real quick, the opening encounter of Paradise Lost in the Gardens, I love the scale and craziness of that fight. I always enjoy assault-like objectives, and so to have to push through bullets, fire, and mortars to disable those front turrets is an epic feeling. But again, it can be done without a single spoken word. The second fight, the tanker defense, you gradually get introduced to the purple flame mechanic. That's raid design 101 right there. And once again, the emphasis on combat over direct mechanics is really awesome. That's always what I loved about the incursions. And once your team falls into the rhythm of which waves are approaching, which areas you need to defend, it becomes that exhilarating experience. The third encounter, the boss fight with Wright, firstly, one of the coolest boss designs in the Division franchise, hands down. The purple flame mechanic reaches its height here. Having an actual melee-based boss in the Division is super refreshing. Normally, that's something you might expect to see in the fantasy genre, World of Warcraft or Destiny, but yet again, they find a way to make it totally realistic for the world of the Division. The sprinkler mechanic feels familiar enough to the franchise. It takes some coordination, but again, can be done if people get a general sense of the fight. And then lastly, the lovebirds. Again, they keep the emphasis on combat here, but introduce those mechanics to make it feel more involved, more in depth. And I think they really made those 2 cleaners feel formidable, so that was awesome. So that's an overview of the Incursion. Let's talk about some of what I've seen on it from the community. Now, of course, this won't be everybody's views, just some recounts of stuff I've seen. And as always, I strongly encourage you all to leave your thoughts below. For the most part, I've seen many agree with my general sentiments that Paradise Lost is really fun, fairly challenging, and distinct enough from raids to be considered its own kind of content. Many have complained about the DPS check nature of it, despite the devs saying that it wouldn't be beforehand. I totally agree that I wish it didn't lean so hard into that, although as I explained over on Twitter, I think that is partly a symptom of the pretty wild power creep the game has had in the past few years. And so without significant tuning to the biggest outliers in the meta, it's pretty hard to balance around those. Beyond that, I have seen some say that Paradise Lost is too easy. I'm guessing that is mostly the raid crowd. I've seen some say it's too hard. Again, I'm guessing that's people who are mostly solely relying on matchmaking. For those struggling to complete it, I understand the frustration. It is important to remember, however, that with all content of this nature, time is your friend. I've already done matchmade runs that cleared every encounter except for the lovebirds, and I have no doubt that in 2 weeks to a month, the matchmaking completion rate will rise, and it will continue to rise throughout the season and beyond. The more people that learn the fights, the more teams that will succeed because of that. So some patience is required there. That brings me to my final point here, and that is my general outlook on the landscape of Division 2 endgame content now that Incursions are in the mix, as well as the general future of the franchise since we now know that the Division 3 is on the way. I've talked about this in some previous videos, but I will solidify it here, especially now that we've seen this Incursion in action, seen what this kind of content has to offer with all of the refinements it's gotten over the years, the development lessons learned. I really do think that Incursions are the future of this kind of content within the Division 2 and the Division franchise as a whole. Now, I will be the first to admit, I love the 2 raids that we have in the Division 2. I think Dark Hours delivered a high-quality, realistic experience in the world despite it being a wild 8-player operation against these big bosses, and I think Iron Horse just upped that all to the next level. I've played both many times, I got all of their exclusive rewards, everything. That said, and I think this has just become more clear after the reactions to Paradise Lost, I just don't think raids fit with the community and player base that the Division 2 has in the same way that something like Incursions do. That's not to say they aren't popular with a subset of the community. There are dedicated players in there that regularly run that content to this day. But whether it's the 8-person requirement that takes a lot to organize, or the fact that there's no matchmaking, which by the way, I still support. I know many want Massive to turn that option on, but the reason they don't is that the completion rate would just be abysmal. Because unlike Paradise Lost, it's not a matter of just learning the fights, but you actually need to communicate with your team in order to complete those mechanics and beat the fights. And that's just not something that can be guaranteed for random groups. So look, if raids took minimal time and resources to put together, sure, I would say make more for Division 2 or continue to feature them in Division 3, because there are people out there who adore them, but given how intensive they are to make, the developers required, the time and plans to execute, the huge amount of testing that goes into them, I just don't think it's worth it when you now have something like Incursions that essentially fill the same role, except they're easier to make and they're far more accessible to the Division specific player base. So if the Division 2 were to receive a year 6, maybe even 7, 8, I would hope that we see one new Incursion per year. I know some have said they want one every season or every other season. Obviously, that's an attractive idea. I would love that. But it's probably a more realistic thing to ask for in a Division 3 with a whole endgame team and strategy from the start, rather than the smaller support team that Division 2 has right now. Plus, it is important to continue delivering experiences and content that interest all types of players, like how with Countdown was very matchmaking-centric, Descent was very solo-friendly, and now Incursions are more group-focused. And so to close this part out, let's say that you're planning out the Division 3's Year 1 endgame. And with the resources at hand, your options are to make 1 raid and 1 incursion or 3 incursions. I would have to go with option number 2, based off of all of those factors that we just went over. They appeal to a much wider amount of the player base, yet they still retain that endgame challenge and appeal, and having just one of that kind of endgame content makes it so much simpler to design a grind loop around, in my opinion. So there you have it, folks. Those are my impressions, thoughts, and an outlook on the new Paradise Lost Incursion in the Division 2. How I think it's been received since launch, and how I hope it's used as a standard for this kind of endgame content moving forward. I'm sure I've made someone mad during this video, but it is important to remember that this is all just my opinion on the matter, and I would love to hear yours. What has been your impression and reaction to Paradise Lost since its release? And seeing what Incursions have to offer, what's your preference on how they handle that kind of content with the Division moving forward? Whatever your thoughts are, leave them down below. I'll be very curious to read through them. And that's going to do it for me today, everybody. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. RogueGold. Out.